The second arcade episode will start with a game that I mostly played on my Commodore 64 when I grew up, but after I eventually tried the original arcade version of Solomon's Key on MAME around 20 years ago, I haven't been able to go back to the 8-bit version since. Although perhaps I should, since I've been planning on doing a comparison of it for a few years now. Solomon's Key was originally released for the arcades by Tecmo in 1986, and to me it is one of the most ingenious single-screen puzzle platformers ever made. When I was a kid, I never really paid much attention to what the name meant, just thought it sounded nice in the context. You control a young wizard named Dana, who can make blocks appear and disappear right next to him, or diagonally below him, and using this magic, you need to pick up the key to open the door in each room and make your exit while dodging all sorts of strange enemies. You can also pick up a certain number of firebolts of varying power that you can use to evaporate enemies. Apparently there are 64 levels in Solomon's Key, but I have never managed to beat all of them, even with an Endless Lives cheat mode on the C64. That said, 15 of the levels are secret, so you don't really need to go through all of them if your only self-set objective is to reach Solomon's room and solve it. However, as with all good Japanese arcade games post-1985, you can only get the good ending by beating all the secret rooms as well as the regular ones, and finally find and use the magic book, the Key of Solomon, to get rid of all the monsters in Solomon's castle. I'm not sure about how popular Solomon's Key was back in its day, but it must have been since it was ported to all the usual consoles and computers at the time, apart from Commodore Amiga, an error which was corrected in 2013. And the game even had a sequel called Fire and Ice, which was originally a Nintendo exclusive, but has been since unofficially ported to other computers. But the original in its original form is the one for me. I'm not sure if anyone would consider this next one even remotely a classic, but Irem's Hammerin Harry can be considered at least having been released in the classic arcade era in 1990. To be honest, I'm still not too familiar with this game, but Hammerin Harry has the dubious honor of being one of the only arcade games I played before emulation came along. I think I only played it once because I wasn't too impressed with it and didn't want to spend any hard-earned pocket money as a kid for an arcade game I wasn't too impressed with. But it was memorable enough for me to dig it up later on through emulation. What put me off in Hammerin Harry was mostly its unfair difficulty. You would die from a single collision with any enemy or projectile, while many earlier games of its kind had their protagonists withstand at least one hit before death. What I initially liked about Hammerin Harry was Harry's speech samples and the ability to use objects as an extension of sorts to your hammer. It took me a few good tries later on to find out that you could actually get a helmet to give you that extra hit point I was so annoyed about earlier, and generally to get into the rhythm of the game. Having a large hammer isn't the most helpful of weapons due to its range, but it does have a surprising amount of power, particularly when you figure out more ways to use it. You can also find some other power-ups such as a super-sized hammer by breaking certain boxes. Although I can now admit Hammerin Harry being a grower, it's not exactly a quality you want to have in an arcade game where you're supposed to get instantly hooked. It is also a brutally difficult game and requires plenty of trial and error type grinding. I might grow to really like it if I wasn't so annoyed by it, but it does represent a certain time and place in my life that has no other real purpose than to remind me of a long bygone time and place. Another arcade classic that I didn't get to properly enjoy until emulation made it possible is Sega's 1986 hit racer, Outrun. I mean, yeah, sure, there were home conversions enough around, and I played at least a few of those, the C64 version plenty enough too. But the original arcade version is such a beast that once you've compared every other version to that, you do get a certain sense of, why ever did they bother? I mean, everybody must have known they could never get it right on home systems. But of course, it's just good business to try your best in these situations. Anyway, I suppose Outrun is one of those games I don't really need to elaborate on. Everybody who's watching these kinds of videos very likely knows it in some form or another. But in short, you drive a Ferrari Testarossa with a beautiful blonde girl on your side, race against the clock and try to reach any of the 5 possible finishing lines on a route you choose at the end of each of the first 4 sections. It's spectacularly fast, rather pretty to look at, and just difficult enough to give you a good challenge. And need I even mention the soundtrack? Absolutely amazing soundtrack by Hiroshi Kawaguchi that in 4 songs practically owns the entire 1980s for those of us who grew up with games. Magical Sound Shower and Splash Wave are probably the best known of the 4, since the C64 version didn't have more. Passing Breeze, which gives the soundtrack one slightly lighter tune that makes the game feel somehow less chaotic, and the absolutely beautiful and surprisingly long Game Over melody on Simulated Road's electric piano just rounds up the whole thing perfectly. Of course, the fun gimmick here is that you can choose the background music track before heading into the game by turning the knob on your radio, a feature that made its way into Sega's Super Hang-On a bit later, as well as Core Design's Jaguar XJ220 on the Amiga, before the Grand Theft Auto series went a bit overboard with the idea. I could go on and on about how great everything about the original arcade version of Outrun is, and I have never even managed to play the game in its original seated cabinet format. Stupidly difficult to find one in this part of the world. But if there is someone out there who hasn't played Outrun in its original form, MAME is a good option. But it has been officially released more lately on the Nintendo 3DS and Switch, apparently as online releases as part of the Sega Ages series. Highly recommendable in any form. One of my favorite Atari arcade games of all time is none of the usual suspects. It is a strange trackball-controlled vector graphics game from 1982 called Quantum. I mentioned this game in one of my Unique Games blog posts some years ago, but in hindsight I didn't really explain the game too well, apart from it having some similarity to another relatively obscure game. The idea is to move a device around the screen that drags a tail behind itself and capture atoms with the tail by making loops around the atoms. The first few levels are basically for getting used to the controller and the capturing mechanics, but after a while the space around the atoms starts filling up with all sorts of harmful particles, some of which you can try to capture and some which you can't. Although Quantum is a solid game on its own, it might have some added value with the fact that it was programmed by Betty Ryan, the first female programmer in General Computer Corporation, which was a hardware and software company formed in 1981 that were also responsible for such arcade classics as Miss Pac-Man and Food Fight for Atari. Quantum's high score table displays her name written with a trackball controller as the original top score, and so if you manage to reach the top spot, your name will also be written with the trackball, which is something I've never seen any other game do. All these little special things makes it a game well worth seeking out, even if only through emulation. We end today's episode with a seriously weird arcade exclusive, which is another one that has been featured in the Unique Games series on the blog. Bali Sente's 1984 game Snacks Jaxson is on a cellular level a breakout variant, but the way it has been built is a bit confusing. The entire game views the main character, Jaxson the Clown, sitting behind a dining table at the center of the screen. At the start of each level, or attempt, Jaxson sneezes off his red clown nose, which acts as the ball of the breakout part of the game. Your head is completely loose thanks to your insanely elastic neck and acts as a part-time bat for the breakout. Yeah, it's a bit bonkers, seeing as this sort of happens sideways, but don't worry about it. The other part of the game is you need to eat all the food items floating in the air before the nose bounces off your face again. For each stage of the game, you need to eat a bunch of food groups to get to the bonus section of the stage, and then move on to the next stage. The first stage, breakfast, doesn't feature any obstacles or hazards, but from lunch, the second stage onwards, you will be harassed by a green goblin cook, throwing chili peppers or soap or some other things in your way. Much like Timber, another Bally game featured in the first Arcade Nostalgia Trip episode, Snacks and Jaxson is not a game that would easily translate to home computers, so there are no conversions available. If you can bother to search for this game online, it can be worth your while, at least if you're into weird games like me.